there's just a limit to that value. And at least I personally kind of believed there wasn't a limit to that value. I believed that once I got to financial security, all problems would be solved. And so the Enough Project is kind of about both saying, hey, let's identify that enough point, but also let's recognize the limits of enoughness that money can give us, and then look to the other expressions that will give us enoughness. And one of the biggest ones, at least in my profession, is using financial resources to do the most good possible out there and solve a lot of these big problems that are out in the wider world.
You're listening to Catalyst Talks, conversations with change agents, outliers, superheroes, and truly conscious leaders modeling what it is to be an unstoppable force for good and truth in this world. What lit these catalysts on fire to do their work, and what nuggets of wisdom can they share with a world literally on fire? I'm your host, Stephanie Trager. I'm a transformational catalyst and life coach to maverick change agents in business, leadership, and life. On this podcast, I wear an eclectic mix of hats, including Earthkeeper, Wayfinder, Truth Teller, coach, lawyer, business, and impact strategist. My intention is holding space for higher purpose, peak wellness, soul mastery, and deeper impact so we can live in harmony with ourselves, each other, and nature. Please subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen. If you love it, please share and spread the word. We're on YouTube and all the podcast platforms. See the show notes on catalysttalks.com for links, and enjoy this episode. My guest today on Catalyst Talks podcast is Brent Kessel, an impact investor, co-founder of Align Impact, and co-founder and former CEO of Abacus Wealth Partners, a $3.9 billion impact wealth management firm whose mission is to expand what's possible with money. He is the author of It's Not About the Money, and Brent combines his years of financial planning and impact investing experience along with a deep understanding of the psychological dimensions of money to help people feel empowered to make significant and lasting changes in their financial lives and in the world around them. Brent's recent co-creation and work on the Enough Project is a beautiful inquiry into how much is enough. He's a deeply heart-centered and impactful change agent, and I'm really excited to drop into this conversation where we discuss how much is enough, what is higher purpose, and what it means to track your purpose. Where does this not enoughness program that is running in society come from? How to navigate life when you're in the story between the story, a pioneer's journey to and of impact, what motivates our hunger for more, how to dismantle the false belief of security, the purpose of money, and how this former CEO integrates psychology and money. This is a deeply profound and moving conversation we have. May you find many nuggets, and stay tuned for this uninterrupted episode after this segment from our sponsor. This episode is brought to you by the Unlocking Higher Purpose 6-part mini course. It is free. So if you have not accessed this 6-part mini course yet, head to unlockinghigherpurpose.com. It's free. We'll put the link in the show notes. If you are navigating anything like we all are right now, whether it's transformation, transition, relationship, work, personal, whatever it is, this is for you. There is so much wisdom in this 6-part mini course, and you will receive an email each day with a link to the episode/session, and you can download the free workbook that has coaching prompts, and they'll really help you extract the medicine, the gifts, the lessons from each of these episodes and help you really unpack whatever is up for you right now. So those sessions include topics from speaking your truth, unlocking higher purpose, tapping into your identity, and how much are you creating from the identity of now versus who you were before you were told to have this identity. Who are you really? And what is the spectrum of higher purpose, moving from identity to purpose identity to our higher purpose? You'll also have access to a beautiful session around peak wellness and what does that mean and why it's so important to amplify our impact in the world, amplify our impact on the world, and amplify our impact from within. So the peak wellness session is so powerful and packed with strategies to help you on your journey towards peak wellness. And then there's the episode on deeper impact in business, leadership, and life, what that means, what it means for you, and what it means for the world. So head over to unlockinghigherpurpose.com and access this free gift. Welcome back to Catalyst Talks podcast. And Brent, thank you so much for being here. Brent, the first line in your bio, I'm a white guy from Africa, brings a lot home for me, having witnessed a bit about your journey these past few years and your commitment to racial and gender equity through deep inquiry and your process around Enough and the Enough Project. As co-founder of Abacus Wealth, an impact investing firm, and founding B Corp, co-founder of Align Impact, and a conscious investor yourself since 1993, I want to know who you are. I want to really explore this conversation for my audience and for us. And you founded Abacus in 1996. That was the year I became a tree sitter in the Redwoods in California. So, that was when I was doing direct action. You were doing direct action. I earned an FBI file. And I think maybe your journey was a little bit more lucrative. So with that, you've really contributed so much to the field of impact investing. I didn't really know this because I've been just doing some more research on your journey. And you are one of the founding pioneers and catalysts. So talk to us about what inspired you, as a young person in your 20s, maybe, right? Like what was like, I'm going to do good. Was it like just non-negotiable? Who are you and what inspired your journey?
Well, thanks, Stephanie. Those very kind words. Well, it's great to be here. I don't think it's as pure as your introduction made it out to be. So I was conflicted. I was raised by, I had multiple dads. My mom was married and divorced a few times, and was very close, and am very close to all of them, but they had different influences on me. So one and my mom were therapists, psychotherapists, and the others were entrepreneurs. And so I kind of had this split of like, am I going to go, the business economics route and be an entrepreneur or work for a for-profit enterprise? Or am I going to help people, figure out what really matters? And I'd been a seeker since a very young age. I sort of was very cognizant of my own suffering and happiness, and would read books, that most 14 and 15-year-olds were not reading. And so I think that, there was this kind of intersection of introspection, personal growth and seeking, psychology, and then on the other hand, a lot of ambition and drive and desire for personal wealth. And so you're right. I was in my mid-20s, and I was actually traveling in India when kind of the insight hit me most strongly that I wanted to somehow get into a profession that merged these worlds, and that led to the formation of Abacus. I think just to tag on to that, because my bio starts with a white guy from Africa, I think that's relevant because I grew up in the heart of apartheid. I was in South Africa from 1968 to 1978, and was in a progressive family that pointed out some of the inequities to me. And then I just began noticing more and more of them by myself. And for example, our beloved nanny, Adelaide, her 2-year-old son died. And I was probably 7 or 8 at this point, and I just couldn't help but know that had Addie's son been white, he likely would have gotten the healthcare he needed to not have died. And I would cry a lot, and I would talk to my mom a lot. And so, I don't want to make this sound so romantic that like 8-year-old grows up to decide he's going to save the world through, helping create an industry. But I think there are seeds of what I've done at Abacus and the desire to use money and influence and other resources for good in that early African experience.
And I'm sure that your journey, it sounds like, a linear path. When we look back, it's easy to look at someone else's life and say, oh, that's a linear path to where you are now. Everything makes sense, right? And I'm sure that it didn't feel all that linear when you were in it. What's really kind of not linear was I was just on my way back, and I know that, and this is where I want to dive into the good stuff. You were also on a sabbatical, and I took a little bit of a break from my own vision quest and was backpacking in California in the Eastern Sierras. And I was watching on the way to the mountains, Nelson Mandela film, the Invictus. And so that the words that were in my head the whole time. And I was thinking about our conversation, like, what are we going to talk about here? And I just want to throw this into the field that these lines have stuck with me. And it's, I'm the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. And so with your work around, and let's unpack all this, your work around really, bringing light to examining bias, closing the gender racial equity gap, and also your work with the Enough Project, how does that, I am the master of my fate, I am the captain of my soul. How does that hold as like an empowering ether around?
It's wow. I don't remember that quote. And it's really, it's landing in an interesting way for me right now. So I'm 54 years old, just launched our second kid off to college a year ago. So in the middle of a lot of transitions at the moment, like being an empty nester. I stepped down as CEO of Abacus in February and handed the reins over to two, very intelligent, powerful, amazing female co-CEOs, Mary Beth Storjahan and Neela Hummel. And I'm still at Abacus. I'm still working there. I'm still a majority shareholder. Excuse me. But it's funny. I would say that kind of master of my soul and kind of directing my fate energy was way more prevalent for me for the last 3 decades than it is right now. So the sabbatical that I've been on has been one of shifting from directing my life predominantly from what I would call kind of a fear and control paradigm to listening and receiving my life and like really paying much more attention to the body's pulls. Where's the curiosity and where does my body get energized, as opposed to telling my body and my workday where we're going to go today or this month or this year and what goals we're going to achieve. And part of that is what Enough is about. The Enough Project, while we can get into the sort of nuts and bolts of it for folks who are looking at their actual resources and saying, is this enough? Is it more than enough? Is it way more than enough? And what do I do about that? It's really about that kind of quality of not needing to drive ourselves to more in any area, love, money, sex, good feelings, good food, just the whole spiritual awakening, like this sort of never-ending drive for more is kind of evolutionarily programmed into us. Our ancestors, the ones that survived anyway, were very driven towards more and towards accumulation. And so we're hardwired that way. But I feel like it deprives us of a lot of opportunity and creates a lot of unnecessary suffering, compared to if we can actually look inside and find the places we are enough and we have enough, and then can open to a whole new world of possibilities that our resources can be channeled towards. It's funny, I just want to make this quick comment. You mentioned coming back from the Eastern Sierra and backpacking. I am in the Eastern Sierra right now, and just yesterday was day hiking on the Pacific Coast Trail and John Muir Trail. So
that's where I was, John Muir Trail. Let me ask you, did it inspire any thoughts about Enough?
So we were on the JMT actually, and kind of headed around Red Cones, sort of toward Red's Meadow, and there's a big burn area. It burned, I don't remember exactly, maybe 5 years ago or something like that. And so there's like a new growth forest in there, and we were walking through it, my wife and I, and we both were just overcome with the sort of the magic of these, 3 to 6 foot trees that were bright green in the middle of like just burn, just ash, just, soil that looked like it couldn't support any kind of life. And just, the Eastern Sierra for me is like, it's funny when people say we gotta fix this problem or the world's gonna end. My reaction is the world's not going to end. The world doesn't have a problem. The planet will be here, and like many species will be just fine. They were here before humans and will be here after humans. It's kind of biodiversity, certainly there's a lot of species that we are causing the extinction of. We do need to worry about that. We do need to worry about probably half of our fellow human beings who are, so far down the have not scale that they are going to be the climate refugees, and they are going to have, a huge amount of suffering if we don't change course in a number of key areas. But the planet itself is not the thing to worry about. So I'd say that was like, the planet is enough and has enough as a whole kind of organism. And we're very narcissistic and kind of, anthropomorphic about everything. And it's like, well, if we don't survive, or if I don't survive, or if I don't keep all my wealth intact, let's take it down to even that level, then everything is wrong. That's not the world's problem.
Wow. That inspires such a deep conversation, because what I hear, because that's sort of what you experience when you're on the John Muir Trail. It's beauty, it's perfection, and it's just life giving. And so that the question always comes up for me when I hear the kind of raging conversation around saving the world and even saving others is this kind of triangle of disempowerment and what biases, what I'm talking about with the triangle of disempowerment. We're either being a victim, the perpetrator, or the rescuer. And so much of the save the world, solve the problems that we're causing possibly, or contributing or colluding with, it still kind of remains on this triangle of disempowerment. And it's just so laced with biases. So I'll offer or ask you, like, what do you ever sense that? Like, is that, I guess the question really is around bias, and how are our biases about our biases even keeping us from the full breadth of our possible, the possible solutions?
Yeah. Well, let me kind of turn into the skid with that question around my profession, which is the profession of wealth management and financial planning and impact investing. And I think the bias of our industry is and has been that financial security is the holy grail, that there's kind of a, even if, we're not talking about people who already have billions and who want just another billion and then they think they'll be happy. I mean, we all cite those cliches constantly, but let's bring it down to sort of more maybe real world or relatable levels. Probably, you, me, most of our listeners are in the top, 10 or 20% of the world's population in terms of our access to resources and healthcare and shelter and food, maybe the top 1% if you look at the world, and not just like the kind of US 1%. And yet we live predominantly in this bias of not enough. And it's, it's kind of bred into us. And so that's what the Enough Project is inviting people into is, and it's not, I think it's important for me to say that I am not approaching the Enough Project from a place of, we have to do this work or else. Like the world needs reparation, it needs regeneration, wealth inequality has to be resolved, and here's what the solution looks like. I may or may not believe some of those things, but to me, that's not where I can be of most service to people, to families, or to individuals. Where I can be of most service is just helping in a very non-shaming, non-blaming way us look at our biases and look at what is and isn't serving us as individuals or as families to actually have a much better life and feel more of a sense of meaning and purpose. There's a quote that I love. I've heard it from David Whyte, and I think it is his quote. I don't recall it being attributed to someone else, but he says, the soul would rather fail at its own life than succeed at someone else's. And I think that really lands for me, because I think so many of us in Western culture and so many of the clients I've met with over 26 years who, have some level of affluence and wealth have succeeded at least in part at someone else's definition of life and success. And, what I'm noticing is that when you're at a certain level of wealth and you go, wow, it's just not kind of juicy anymore to keep aiming for financial security or aiming for a higher net worth. Or if you have a health scare or have a parent die or a sibling die, or, and I don't want to put too much emphasis on one particular number, but it does seem to be that around age 50, a lot of people go through a bit of a transformation that's like, my life is probably half over, maybe 3/4 over, maybe if I'm really unlucky, like 90% over. What's it all about? And there's this real sense that there's less time to go than has already passed. And any of those things, health scares, having enough money, or turning 50 or 55 or 60, whatever the number might be for someone, can bring up this like yearning to find meaning and purpose through a different formula, if you will, than what we've pursued in the past decades.
So do you find that the inquiry into enough, like, really, does it resonate for younger folks who are sort of on their purpose path as well?
It does for some. I mean, it's less common, I would say, in general, but I mean, there's a couple of things to say about that. I mean, there's a lot of inheritors or folks who have sort of, either through skill or luck or a combination, done something that, had some level of economic success, whether it's being part of a company that had a fantastic rise and then a liquidity event, or being an entrepreneur. So yeah, I've met plenty of sort of late 20s and 30 somethings who come in and say, yeah, this is a crazy amount of money that I never thought I was going to have. And so what now? And I think we've seen some of this with the Giving Pledge, and there are younger members of that crowd. And we've seen, many of the wealthiest people in the world allocating more to philanthropy. And we can have all kinds of debates about what's effective or not effective within those worlds. But nonetheless, it's I think there's a paradigm shift compared to prior generations of the uber wealthy and what they would do with their wealth in general. Some folks have been asking me lately, like, is there a way to expand the Enough project so that people who don't necessarily have tons of wealth yet or aren't an inheritor might ask themselves that enough question before they get on the hamster wheel or as they're getting on the hamster wheel? And I haven't done much thinking about that. I mean, for me personally, I kind of needed to walk this path of drive and ambition and entrepreneurial success. I needed to show myself that it wasn't that, that it would give me certain things. I mean, money does make some things easier, and that it wouldn't give me a whole bunch of other things. And that also, to maintain my connection to the fact that I can downscale and I can live simply. And I'm lucky in my relationship that we both feel very flexible and happy backpacking, traveling around the world and staying in, 2-star types of places sometimes. And, we certainly like 4- and 5-star places a lot of the time too. So we're, by no means are we like voluntary simplicity addicts, but it's possible. And that's a very relieving, like, pressure valve. If you're worried, as we sit here recording this, stock markets around the world are down over 20%. We have, a war going on. There's, COVID isn't over. There's all kinds of uncertainties out there. So knowing that, if we have to, we could always move to a little 1 or 2 bedroom apartment, and we don't need to own this condo in the mountains, and we don't need this, we don't need that. That to me is an even more powerful kind of sense of enough than looking at a balance sheet that's got a bunch of zeros on it.
I love when I hear you speak about the Enough Project, and just, I could feel your heart, and I've seen you kind of facilitating around the process. And it's really, there's this very linear aspect where you're, quantifying what's enough with numbers, or like really taking a look at your life. And then there's also this more psycho-spiritual component. And when I reflect on enough, and I was actually looking up the website, I came across, oh yeah, there's this old organization that I remember from like 20 years ago almost, the Enough Project, where they're actually, it's I don't know if you've heard of this, but they are working to end conflict bring peace and end conflict in Africa, in African countries. And so, but really the essence of enough, it's so broad, right? It's like enough around wealth, enough around resources, and like how much of this enough, I'm not enough, I'm not good enough. It's like a most dominant negative thought of what percent of like intellectuals on the planet, I'm not enough, I'm not doing enough, I'm not good enough. And so how do you find, does that come into the conversation around resources? Because it really is just, as you mentioned before, it's stemming from scarcity.
Yeah, I mean, it does come into the conversation somewhat. I think it depends on how introspective the person, is. I certainly know that my ambition and drive to accumulate wealth was in large part to compensate for feelings of fear and insecurity that came into my life in my childhood. I made decisions. I remember making decisions at like age 12 and age 9 that I'm going to do better at this, and I'm going to invent that, or I'm going to be this wealthy, so that I can make sure people won't leave me like in the way that fathers left during divorces. And again, my fathers I'm still very close to, and I think all my parents have done a fantastic job, as good a job as they could. But when you're 4 and then 12 and go through these experiences, at least for me, it was like, well, what did I do wrong, or what could I have done differently, or what could I do better? And especially, what can I do better as an adult? How do I make sure that my mate and I don't cause this pain for our children? And so I'm saying all that with a kind of like a huge asterisk on it, because it doesn't work. Like the things we think are going to compensate for our pains or our traumas from earlier life almost never work, if they're substitutes, if they have any kind of sort of addictive or unconscious quality to them. And so to your question, I think if someone is willing or able to kind of look at, why was I going for this, and why am I still kind of, that like, I notice the parts of my mind that still feel like I should do this and I should do that, and I need to be accountable for this or that. What is that for? Who's that for? And it's funny, on my sabbatical, I did a retreat in South Africa called Track Your Life, that was with game trackers and lion trackers. And one of the paradigms they taught us, I won't go into the whole paradigm, but the first stage of it is called the meltdown. And it's much like the caterpillar becoming the butterfly. And first it has to turn to goo, and that basically means not knowing, like letting go of the known without having a new known to jump to or to cling to. And most of us in this culture don't slow down enough, and we don't wait long enough. Like we leapfrog. We're like, okay, sold that company, or retired from that, or left this relationship, now ready for this next thing. And I think a very uncultivated art in American culture especially is the art of waiting and listening and kind of attuning to what the somatic, what the body gets curious about and gets energized by, after that meltdown phase has been allowed to really run its course.
Beautiful. That I saw someone say this recently, and it stuck like goo, that being in the story between the story. And like there is a story in between stories. So that's what that sounds like, an amazing opportunity. I have a process I work with around higher purpose and tracking higher purpose. And it's this kind of continuum where we start off with identity and all the roles and what do we have to burn through those roles to get to like out of our identity and all those traps to get to our purpose. And then once we get into our purpose, and there become all these like identities around our purpose. And what's this like this continuum towards our higher purpose and tracking that. So in your experience in your sabbatical, I'm curious if you want to share any insights that came from tracking.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think purpose changes a lot. So like one experience, I've identified with being an impact investor and identified with being someone who's traveled to the developing world on 6 different continents and is comfortable, in the favelas in Rio and comfortable in, in the slums of Nairobi and Calcutta and also, very early to invest in a number of the businesses that brought solutions to poverty and other kinds of social issues. So that was kind of an identity I wore with pride, with sort of a sense of honor. And to come really clean, I went to Ghana on this trip to tour some regenerative agriculture farms that are owned or not owned, but they are involved with a social enterprise that I'm on the board of called WARC, W-A-R-C. And I was like struck by the, I don't know what to call it, but I was sort of repulsed by the dirt and the smells and the patriarchy and the abuse of animals and, just like kids not in school, kids having, working hard, like just out, 6-year-olds, 8-year-olds out there shepherding cattle or, working in a tire, shop or something. Like, anyway, just the whole experience for me is like, oh my God, I just feel done with this. I don't like this. My body doesn't enjoy this. I don't want to be here. And so I haven't shared this publicly at all. This podcast will be the first time that comes out. But, there's like this death of that part of my purpose. Not that I'm not going to be an impact investor, but that I may not be the guy who goes into the developing world to see it firsthand, which some would argue is an evolution, is a good thing. Like going into the field to sort of meet the beneficiaries of your work. It's not so much for them, it's more for you. It's more for you to pat yourself on the back or feel the passion and warm glow that can come from seeing the people or animals or ecosystem that your philanthropy or impact investing has helped. But actually my bigger impact is probably sitting in offices and coffee shops in North America and Europe and, helping wealthy people navigate their own relationship to enough so that more resources can be freed up to do that kind of good. So for me, higher purpose is shifting. And if you had asked me 2-3 years ago, like my highest purpose was make Abacus as impactful as I can possibly make it, the company I founded. And now I'm much more like, Abacus is very impactful, and yes, it's on its journey, and our new leadership team is very passionate and has a very inspiring mission statement and some goals that are, incredible in terms of the numbers of people they want to help and how deeply they want to help them in a very short amount of time. But it's kind of not the only arrow in my quiver, or maybe that's a bad metaphor. It's not the only, it's not my only expression of impact. And so my higher purpose is shifting. And a big part of it right now feels like this kind of waiting and listening. And the mantra of this phase is, I don't know, and that's okay. Like if someone were to say to me, what is your higher purpose right now? My most honest answer is, I don't know. And letting that be okay. That's not an acceptable answer in most circles in our culture. And I think, I hope it can become a much more acceptable answer.
Thank you for sharing that story about Ghana. And I think it's probably so many, there's so many nuggets in there. And what if that question about, 'cause it's funny that you just said, like, for so many people, what I don't know, it's not enough. And there's that enough word again. But I was coming in for this conversation. I was out for a run and it was cut short. And I was like, shit, that wasn't enough. And I just, when you start to notice, it's everywhere, it's pervasive. And why isn't it enough just to be? Like, what if our energy is contributing to the, I don't know, shifting the field around us, and that's enough? So there's just so many ways this conversation is so potent. And I love that you're really focused with a very specific kind of niche and target, because it is a portal. And so I'm curious, when you think about enough and risk, because I think about your early days, right? And even when you were kind of seeking whatever it was, you wouldn't have started these large organizations, like these big missions, if you didn't have a high capacity for risk.
Yeah.
And so, how do they reconcile? How do they, is there a polarity? Like, speak about risk and enough.
Fantastic. I haven't thought about that. Yeah. So for me, you're absolutely right. I started, Abacus in particular, and then Align. I mean, Align was 2015, and that was much more opportunistic. It wasn't a sense of like, I'm going to bet the farm, on creating something that will really have a lot of impact around the world. And it is having a lot of impact with a lot of foundations and families and other financial advisory firms that are essentially outsourcing all of their impact due diligence and sourcing to Align. So it's a fantastic resource, and I don't actually know of very many others doing that work. But the risk to start Abacus for me, definitely. I mean, I look back and I'm like, holy cow, how did I had like very little experience. I'd been on the sort of real estate finance side of the industry for 5 years or so. I'd gotten my certified financial planner designation, so I had the book knowledge, but like just hanging out a shingle after that without apprenticing myself to someone was, risky at best and maybe reckless. I was very, very careful, and I was a very prudent fiduciary to my clients. So I think, some of my first like 3 to 5 clients are still clients, 26 years later. So, but for me, the risk came from not enough. I mean, I'm Jewish. My ancestors, fled Lithuania and Holland and Russia at various times, whether it was just pogroms and anti-Semitism in the late 19th century or Nazis in the 30s. My paternal grandfather was the only survivor of his entire family. The rest of his family, his siblings and parents, were all murdered by Nazi firing squads in Lithuania. And so I think there's like if you believe in sort of intergenerational trauma or like somatic kinds of, trauma storage, I don't know if I believe in that, but because I've suffered from a lot of anxiety, that doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense when you look at my life. That's one theory I have, that it could come from that. But certainly I grew up in a very risk tolerant family. My stepdad, my second father figure, was very entrepreneurial, and I mean, both my dads were really. And so that was just kind of the soup that I was stewing in, was like, yeah, you go for it and you take risks and you add value and you do what you have to do and you work as hard as you have to work. Because otherwise you don't survive. Like, that's the history of our people. You will just not survive unless you do that. So it doesn't even feel like risk. It feels like the risk is in not doing it. So that was my paradigm, but I love your question because it's making me think about a different kind of risk tolerance. And that is, it's the psychological risk to let go of the known. Which is where I am right now. Like, it would be much easier. I'm 54, I'd like to think I've got a good 20, 30 years of like, cognitive aliveness and a great network and reputation and lots of influence and businesses that I can express different things through, and philanthropy I can do. I'd like to think that, I'd like to think, I believe it is true that just kind of continuing that down that path and just leveling up and leveling up and leveling up is is the least risky thing I can do, because it's known. The riskier thing is acknowledging I have enough, or as you just said, like, what if we just are enough, just by virtue of being, just by virtue of like having been born. I'm a fairly deeply spiritual person, not in a monotheistic religion, but I do a lot of meditation practice, mostly in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And, one of our sort of realizations through practice is that there is this kind of sentience, this basic awareness in all of us, in humans and in many animal species as well. And we don't really know where that comes from. Like, even the most advanced physicists don't know where that comes from. We don't wake up in the morning and flip a switch on and say, okay, there's my awareness switch. Now I'm going to be aware. It's just there. So it's kind of like it's unborn, you can't point at when it started. And what if that is enough? Like, the fact that we have sentience and have awareness, just by that alone means you get to just be. Like, otherwise maybe you wouldn't, like, you'd have to, it's almost like a video game where you'd have to accumulate a certain number of tokens to then have awareness. Like, it doesn't work that way. There is no exchange for our basic awareness. It just is here as a gift. And so the risky thing for me is getting off the hamster wheel of achievement and drive. And what's my next big thing going to be? Even the Enough project. I mean, I'm looking at that through this I don't know lens. Like, when people say, what is it? Who's it going to help? How's it going to help them? How will we measure success? My answer is, I don't know. And I don't want to know for quite a while, at least a lot of months, if not a couple of years. So yeah, there's this sense of shifting from what has been, the 25-year plan, like, get married, start a family, start a company, make the company successful, do good for people, don't just make money for yourself. Like, that's been the 25-year plan. In many ways, I feel like I'm at the end of that plan, and it fulfilled certain things and didn't fulfill a whole bunch of other things that I thought it would. Like, speaking to earlier versions of myself who might be listening, like you said, the younger folks who are like, do I do this now? Do I take these risks now? I think it's fine if that's your path, as long as you don't oversell it to yourself, as long as you don't believe that that's going to solve all the problems, or, if you get there, whatever there is, for many people, especially in my profession, in the financial planning world, it's a net worth number. And I don't care if your number is, 100,000 or 100 million, like, it will not fill up the emptiness, that every human being has certain pockets of emptiness and certain forms of suffering that nothing will solve other than being with them, I believe. And that doesn't even solve them. It just makes them easier to kind of, to tolerate, and they don't sort of amplify. But yeah, so I love this idea of risk. And I think the Enough Project's relationship to risk is about the risk of not continuing the path of accumulation, which is very scary to get off.
There's so much there. I'm just letting that drop in. What standing out is the piece about consciousness. And, what if that's enough, that we are just exploring our consciousness? I mean, and that sounds kind of very ungrounded, because in reality, in this three-dimensional world, we have needs. And, it's a privilege to say, hey, I'm just going to explore my consciousness. I have a very similar background as you, my lineage from Eastern Europe, and also Jewish, and also a handful of survivors, and grew up in that same kind of hunger. But I resisted it really young. So I was really interesting hearing how you shared this, because that was my father, and I'm close to the 50s, but my father, I was like, I am not doing that. I am not going there. Like, he was so hardcore, and I was the one child that resisted it. And I'm starting my 25-year path now. because I've been spending the last 25 years like trying to figure out who the hell I am and what is this consciousness voice in my head and what's it all about. So it's interesting because back then I was like, I was with that. What is the risk of not being true to myself? And so in your process is part of this question around being true, like about being true to yourself. And that quote that you shared before, the David Whyte piece was beautiful. It's like, what is truth? What is your truth? I mean, have you ever found that you're not fully speaking your truth?
I've definitely found, I mean, I'm sure there have been many times I'm not fully speaking my truth. I mean, in some ways, when I'm telling myself there's not enough, when I've had so many moments of, this was in my book, It's Not About the Money, which I wrote in 2008, where I would, there's one kind of financial archetype called the guardian, who's, on his best days, he's prudent and careful about money and sort of knows the numbers. But on his worst days, he's just like anxious without a good reason. Just like I remember having a client who would tell me he'd just stay up till 2-3 in the morning with Quicken, like poring over his spending and like trying to figure out where it all went. And I mean, this is someone who 20 years ago was, in their late 20s and had $4.5 million of net worth. So like there was no real survival fear, but in his body, there was very much survival fear. So I've had lesser versions of that where, I would be like, okay, I'm going to figure out what we've been spending this last year. I'm going to figure out what we have. I'm going to, and I've not never, but until very recent years, I haven't been able to do that in a kind of soft, open-hearted, kind of soft front body kind of way. It's always been a, chest contraction and a tight jaw and I just know I'm going to find something that's going to ruin us and, So those I would call not telling the truth. And I think there's multiple truths, right? So I think that's part of this, I don't know, and that's okay, is like, I don't think there's one higher purpose and I don't think there's one path, just like I don't think there's one romantic partner that, that is the one. I think we treat these different aspects of life as practices and you work at it. Like yesterday was my 24th wedding anniversary. The only way we got there was by working at it and having many times, including in recent times, where it felt untenable, where it felt like, oh my God, how are we going to get through this? And it's part of, the growth path to like turn into those skids. So I feel like I'm trying to tell myself a greater truth now than I have in the past. Like accumulating more net worth is not going to, in and of itself, change this relationship to enough. I'm also trying to tell myself the truth. I believe it's a truth that just having huge amounts of more impact, while better than not having more impact, is also not just going to mean suffering goes away or that I suddenly feel like enough all the time. I do think for many people that I'm working with around the Enough Project, it can bring a much more profound sense of meaning and purpose and aliveness. And if it involves family members, kids or spouses or siblings, it can bring family togetherness. And also, where do we not see things the same way? Where do we see things the same way? How do we navigate that? So, it's rich with opportunity. And so, yeah, I think telling the truth about it, to me, it's like tracking wild game, which is what this retreat was about. And the metaphor of that to our own lives. By the way, if you or any of your readers are interested, there's a book by Boyd Varty, who is the guy who led our retreat, called The Lion Tracker's Guide to Life. And it's just a 3-hour listen. And I would really recommend listening rather than reading, because he mimics animal sounds in parts of it. He speaks in the local Shangaan language in parts of it. So it's a gorgeous listen. But when you're tracking game, you are on track some of the time and you're off track most of the time. And I kind of think that's true in our lives. We don't like to admit it. So we just kind of feel yucky in those moments where we're off track, and we don't really have a good answer when someone says, how you doing? Unless it's, unless we have a deep relationship with that person and a lot of honesty. And in that case, the answer might be, oh, I feel kind of yucky, but I don't really know. Like, I don't know what's next, or I don't know how I'm doing, or I don't know how to feel better right now. So, that feels like truth to me at the moment.
I love the idea of saying, I don't know, and that's enough. And start to really indoctrinate that into the field of possibility. Because I mean, like, even with the Enough Project, what's your marketing message? Like, we don't know, and that's enough. Everything is just, it's like kind of overwhelm the expectations, right? Yes. So thank you for sharing this this journey you're on, and we'll share a link to that book because I want to hear it. Really excited to listen to that. I love just even the sense of tracking. It's an innate sense that we've lost. And I want to just speak to one more thing. And it is this thought, like this just inquiry I'm in for this last year around the holographic, well, my whole life, but really diving into this with folks on this podcast is just the holographic nature of reality. And so in just your own contemplation around enough, around the scarcity program, around your work around, with gender and racial equity, when we really get into the systemic cause of everything, there's this kind of what it could be, scarcity. It could be just whatever the mentality is that drove our systems to be created as they are, and for us to be continuing to collude with them. And then when we look at our own beingness and all of our issues and traumas, and we look at our lineage and just the generational trauma, there's just this, I'm finding there's this holographic imprint in everything. And so I'm just going to park that for you. And like, what does that bring up for you? Because, one example of it is, well, where does scarcity live in me? If I look at something that bothers me, the Taliban, right? The violence, where like, extraction, where does extraction live in me? Everything has this kind of holographic expression in ourselves. We're all part of this, oneness, if we really want to look at it that way. So how does that land for you?
I appreciate you parsing that out for me, because I wasn't sure what you meant when you said holographic imprint at first, but now I understand. I look at the kind of quote violent parts of myself, which, most of the violence most of us commit is inward. The way we speak to ourselves is so punitive and so kind of demanding. I often say to people, like, imagine speaking that way to your best friend or your child or whoever, like, and people do sadly speak to their children in similar ways to they speak to themselves. But, I think one of the ways people like the Dalai Lama are able to generate so much compassion for pretty much everybody is when you see someone doing something externally violent or verbally violent, while so many of those things are absolutely inexcusable and we need protections and we need to change things. They always stem from inner suffering. They always stem from, a deep inner wound. And that person, if they're not, like mentally ill, is speaking to themselves with greater violence than what we're seeing them speak to others with. Now, I'm not the Dalai Lama by any stretch, and I'm not able to just generate compassion when I see someone speaking unkindly or doing something with violence. But yeah, I think the violence I've committed against myself has been predominantly like pushing through. Like when I first started to notice anxiety 20 years ago, just being like, suck it up. This is life. You have to do this. You have to provide for this family. You have to do the standard of living. You have to have a house and a swimming pool because those were the happiest days of your childhood. And so, that's my sort of extraction or my kind of violence. There's another thing I'm looking at, which is my wealth was created and my reputation was created in an industry whose primary value proposition is, let us show you how you can be financially secure. Either how you already are financially secure or what you need to do to get there. And we don't really define what financial security can't give you, like the things we've been talking about in this conversation. And maybe some would say that, well, that's not your job. Like, that's the job of, spiritual teachers or religious figures or philosophers. But I have a little bit of a feeling of, I don't know, like a slight obscuring of truth, if you will, like to sell, hey, you're going to be great. Like, look, you've got this much now, you earn this much, you spend this much, the investments do this well, and here's how good it is, and you're fine, you're good, you can achieve these top 3 goals you mentioned us on your list. And I think largely that is what most people who go to a financial planner are looking for. And especially if you're going to a financial planner who's mission aligned and purpose driven and helping clients use their resources in values aligned ways, you get that as either a cherry on top or as an integral part of the process, and that feels even better to the client. But there is something about financial security it's oversold in our culture. It has too much emphasis, and otherwise, if it didn't, I don't believe people would pay the levels of fees they pay to wealth managers and financial planners. It's a very highly compensated profession, even relative to like law and accounting and brain surgery and lots of other things that are more valuable in many cases. And so I do think there's a little bit of snake oil might be too disparaging, but there's a little bit of we're going to make it all okay, and just come with us. We'll and there's amazing work going on, and there's so many people in our industry that are really alleviating a lot of insecurity and suffering and anxiety for their clients. So I don't want to say or pretend that like the industry as a whole is like corrupt and selling something that's got no value. It does have value. There's just a limit to that value. And at least I personally kind of believed there wasn't a limit to that value. I believed that once I got to financial security, all problems would be solved. And so the Enough project is kind of about both saying, hey, let's identify that enough point, but also let's recognize the limits of enoughness that money can give us, and then look to the other expressions that will give us enoughness. And one of the biggest ones, at least in my profession, is using financial resources to do the most good possible out there and solve a lot of these big problems that are out in the wider world. But yeah, I love what you said about just looking at violence towards the self, even verbal violence, the sense of scarcity towards the self that we then operate in a world environment where we act kind of ignoring scarcity in many around natural resources, and treating many other beings, certainly all the animals and many of the human beings, as if they're different, like they're vastly lesser beings than us. And yet, if we imagine trading places with any of those 2 billion folks who live on less than enough for basic needs, or any of the hundreds of billions of animals that we use for our own pleasure, like we wouldn't trade places in a heartbeat with any, the suffering is immense. And so I do think I like your holographic imprint paradigm.
Thank you so much, Brent. You have such a big heart. And one of the things, like, I'd be really curious to know first before I release you to your beautiful John Muir environment is about, your work around with archetypes and really integrating the psychology and money piece early on, right? So it's not like just now waking up to this enough process and seeing sort of like the duality of the financial industry, but you have been integrating the deeper psychological pieces, right, for a while. So how much is that are you bringing forward right now with the Enough project?
It's a great question. Yeah. So, I mean, that's part of what comes from, being raised by therapists, that I did bring the psychological into the way I worked at an early stage, as you said. It kind of arises organically. And so it depends on the person that I'm talking to or working with. If they earned their wealth, they are probably an empire builder, a saver, someone like that. And so they have a lot of these kind of driven qualities that you and I have already talked about in this conversation. If they're an inheritor, they could be any number of the archetypes, but often there's some idealism. There's a sense of like creative pursuits or philanthropy and impact investing and social activism being really the highest calling in their lives and how they want to use their money. And so my whole model around the psychology of money is there's nothing better or worse about any of the behaviors or archetypes. There's just sort of good expressions of each of them and kind of not bad expressions, but like, self-harming expressions and other harming expressions of each of them. Even though like my industry loves savers and, the more frugal someone is and the more they've accumulated, the more a financial planner will say, oh, that's great. You're doing so well. But in my worldview, that person needs some balance where they are able to spend a little more on themselves and some sensory pleasure, which is something the pleasure seeker is great at. Or they may need to do some more around compassion and empathy, which is what the caretaker is great at. And so it's all about finding kind of balance between these different archetypes. So yeah, at times I will, enough project clients and folks in the nonprofit side of the work that we do, where we just lead conversation circles, I will have them take the archetype quiz, which if you want to link to it, it's at abacuswealth.com/quiz. It takes 5 minutes, and then we can look at those results and say, hey, these are the dominant archetypes in you, these are the dormant ones. So if we're going to kind of take that risk we talked about before of stepping off the hamster wheel that has been familiar to us, here are some of the practices that we need to cultivate so that the other archetypes start to get built up.
Or you can just stay in the unknown, and that's enough.
Exactly. Totally.
All right. Thanks so much, Brent, for being here. Is there any other last juicy bit of wisdom that you've kind of received from your sabbatical that's, there's a lot of people struggling. There's a lot of people also kind of seeking permission to be okay, even in hard times, right? Where there are people suffering, it's okay to be okay also. Yeah. So anything pop up for you on that?
Yeah, two little things. So one, doesn't relate to the prompt you just gave, but one of the things I read or learned along the way is if it doesn't feel good, stop doing it. And it was like such a simple thing that came upon me, and I'm like, wow, really? I have permission to do that? Yeah, you just stop doing the thing that doesn't feel good. And that can change from moment to moment, right? So like your mother-in-law invites you over for tea, and you check in with your body and you're like, and there's a slight contraction and it's barely noticeable. And so usually it's super easy for us to just skip over, but try to notice these very small cues. And that's what you do out on the game paths in the wilderness is you're like, oh, there's a tiny piece of dirt on that blade of grass that's a little bit crumpled. That probably means like the hippo came through here sometime in the last 2 hours. And so pay attention to those kinds of little cues in our bodies. And if it doesn't feel good, if it's a negative cue, then say no and let that be okay. And then another practice that actually So I revisited when I was in Cape Town as part of the sabbatical, my best friend from ages 6 to 10, who is a performance artist. Yeah, he's taken a very different life path than me. And we were walking around these amazing botanical gardens called Kirstenbosch in Cape Town. They're just gorgeous up against the back of Table Mountain. And he would greet every person we passed, every single family, every person, every toddler, every elderly couple. And I said, what's this about? You know, he'd be like, hey, how's it? Or, you know, hope you're having a great day, or hi there, you know, whatever. Greeting felt good to him in the moment. And he's an introvert. Like, this is not this guy's personality. He's not that sort of life of the party kind of guy. But he said, try it on. He said, it's just amazing to sort of, yeah, some people will just, you know, be sort of stone-faced and not even respond. But a lot of people, you notice this kind of uplifting at having their existence acknowledged. And it's almost like that thing we talked about, like, you're enough just because you're alive. You're enough because you can take a breath right now. You're enough because you're aware. And that's what I'm saying hi to. And so I've tried that practice on. Just greet everyone you pass in whatever way feels right to you. And some of them will fall flat. And if you're with your family or friends or whatever, they might look at you like you've gone nuts, but it's a cool practice.
I love that. I love that. I actually would add to that practice of saying hello to trees. You know, the trees that you walk by every single day, they're sentient beings, perhaps, and they like to be acknowledged too. And then what is that? Like, when you start saying hello to the trees, it just opens up a whole other portal. So
I assume you've read the Overstory.
I have. I've kind of lived, you know, I've lived in the trees. And so we've got that. They talk, they do speak.
Yeah.
But that's for part 2.
Yes. So I absolutely love that book. It's fantastic. And I do, yeah, trees and animals and just dirt, you know, like all of it, like everything's alive around us. And, you know, yeah, it's going to be super interesting to see, you know, how this all evolves, because, you know, as I said 45 minutes ago, I don't think the world is going extinct. You know, humans maybe, and certainly way too many other species are. There's cures for diseases we don't even know about right now that are in plants and insects that we are causing the extinction of. So I think biodiversity loss, you know, and climate change, you know, is on an equal level of climate change. And then there's lots of future generations. I'll throw one other thing out. I read a great book called The Good Ancestor. I didn't realize this, but there've been 100 billion humans that have lived and died in our past. There's almost 8 billion alive right now. And if you take today's birth rates and extrapolate forward 50,000 years, there's going to be 6.75 trillion humans that are still to be born and still to die. And yet none of them have any voice in our democracies, in our corporate boardrooms, in our philanthropies, you know. And so when we, you know, we often just talk about, we shouldn't do this, or you know, we shouldn't let climate change go to this, or we shouldn't destroy these ecosystems. But we don't actually think about for who. We just sort of think about, it's the right thing to do. In actual fact, there are trillions of stakeholders out there that, you know, that are the ones who are either going to benefit or suffer from our actions. And to me, that was super helpful, that like, my great grandchild, if you want to make it super personal, or, you know, the person on the other side of the planet I'll never meet. So protecting future generations, I think, is a hugely underfunded area in philanthropy and impact investing to a lesser extent. But I would love people to think about, you know, explicitly future generation protection as they think about how to use their surplus, the amounts they have that are beyond enough.
Thank you for that. Actually, Danny Amalgor was on the podcast a few months ago and also mentioned that book and The Good Ancestor. And I think that really opens up another, I'm not going to go into the whole thread, but it does open up the question around bias. What's even our bias, or what is an ancestor, you know, and what is a future generation? So even the conversation around how do you protect that, and that's a we have to be careful whose hands that conversation is held by, because it's very easy. I feel like what I'm trying to say is that we're always colluding with the system. And this system, my father, for example, he was like, it used to be so good. It's just not like it used to be, when the economy was great, when we had all that we wanted, we could buy everything, there was interest, and he's not seeing that it was good for you. It was good for you, but like it wasn't set up to work and to, be sustainable. And that's why it's dismantling. And there's this whole generation that's not really seeing that. And to the point around population growth, there's a conversation in China that because of the one child rule, there's a generational problem. Like there's not going to be enough people in the population, in the working population. So, it's kind of short-sighted, but how does that, what are the ramifications of that kind of like short-sighted, dealing with that short-sighted issue? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. Yeah, and on the other hand, they have a really robust climate plan because they're able to do long-term planning in a way that we're not. When leadership changes every 2 to 4 years, and we do need. From what I've been seeing, I believe world population is going to stabilize around 10 to 11 billion, and assuming we're able to bring enough people out of poverty. Because kids are insurance, kids are retirement plans, kids are the 401ks of Africa and Southeast Asia. Like that's who's going to take care of you in your old age. And mortality means you're going to lose a lot of that 401k, before you ever get there. So high birth rates aren't just about, contraception, education. It's also about like, what are the economic opportunities and social safety nets that exist in those cultures? Yeah, but I like what you said, and I actually wanted to jump in and say we are the system. It's not like the system isn't serving me and I'm against the system. Like we're all the system.
That's a good note. I'm just going to chew on that one for a while today. Yeah. Thank you so much, Brent. So yeah, we are the system. And can you just repeat that David Whyte quote again, and also share where people might find? We're going to add all the links in the show notes to where people can find you and some of the things that you've referenced. But if there's anything top of mind you want to add.
The David Whyte quote, that, as I recall it, is the soul would rather fail at its own life than succeed at someone else's. As far as where to find me, abacuswealth.com/Brent. It has my bio there, and then you can just there's several links to kind of get in touch with our folks that can, connect you over to me. And my book is It's Not About the Money, published by HarperCollins. It's available on wherever you buy books. I did mention the quiz, abacuswealth.com/quiz, which will show you your dominant and dormant financial archetypes. I'd say if there's interest in the Enough project and potentially, understanding more about that or getting more engaged in that, reach out through the first link I gave with my bio, and the folks at Abacus will pass your email along to me, and we'll get in touch as appropriate.
Thank you so much for your time and energy, Brent, and everything that you contribute.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Thank you.
Really
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Catalyst Talks. Stay tuned for what's up next, and please subscribe to our podcast and rate us wherever you listen. You'll find these all at catalysttalks.com. Join the conversation on social media, and if you'd like to reach out, please send me, Stephanie, a private message through stephanietrager.com. Your attention means the world to me. Thank you, thank you, thank you.